Every year in the spring, we always begin to ask ourselves, when is Easter? Because that's going to tell us if we have an early Lent or a late Lent, and we can, plan our family get-togethers with our friends and so on and so forth. And the calculation of Easter is pretty precise, but for a lot of people, esoteric. So we're going to look today at how the early Christians calculated the celebration of Easter. And the reason we're going to do that is because it shows us papal authority. That's right. In the early church, there was a huge controversy over how and when to calculate Easter. And the Pope stepped up, the Bishop of Rome, and said, here's how we're going to do it. And it led to excommunications. That might surprise you. The reason we're covering this is because a lot of people say that, yeah, there was a Bishop of Rome or the Church of Rome was important, but the popes didn't think they had universal supremacy or universal authority in the early days. And we can see in this controversy, which is in the 2nd century, around, mid 100s to the late 100s, that no, the Pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, did believe that he had authority to bind on earth, to bind consciences, and in particular to establish a universal way for celebrating Easter. So let's get started. In a previous video lesson here at the New St. Thomas Institute, we looked at finding the historical date of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And we saw that in the Jewish calendar, that date is Nisan 14. Nisan 14. Nisan is a lunar month, and the 14th day is when there's a full moon in that month. The moon has a 28-day cycle, so at day 14, the moon is full. Now, Christ, as we know, and we saw in that previous lesson, he was crucified during that time, the Passover time, Nisan 14. And so in the early church, they wanted to remember the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ on an annual basis, just as we do today. And so they said, well, we know when that was. We'll just celebrate it on Nisan 14. And the name of that group who followed this pattern had a special name given to them. It was a Latin name. And that name is the Fourteeners, or in Latin, the Quartodecimans. The Quartodecimans. That means simply the Fourteeners. They would only celebrate Easter, that annual celebration, on the 14th day of Nisan. Now, back in Rome and in other places of the church, as we'll see in a moment, they had a different custom. They would celebrate the feast of the resurrection of Jesus Christ on the Sunday after Nisan 14. And the reason for this was that Christ rose on a Sunday. And therefore, the celebration should be held on a Sunday, not on a certain day of the week, because Nisan 14 could have landed on a Tuesday. And that means everybody is at work, first of all, because they had work days just like they did nowadays. And it wasn't on a Sunday. And the church came together on a Sunday for the Eucharist. And so throughout the world, they celebrated the resurrection of Jesus Christ on the Sunday following Nisan 14. Now, this controversy goes back to the mid-2nd century, about the year 150, and St. Irenaeus explains what happens. Our friend St. Polycarp, who we talked about in the previous video lesson, comes to Rome to meet with the Pope, and here's what happens. St. Irenaeus writes, quote, "Neither could Anicetus," that was the Pope, "persuade Polycarp not to observe what he had always observed with John, the disciple of our Lord, and the other apostles with whom he had associated. Neither could Polycarp persuade Anicetus to observe it. And he said that he ought to follow the customs of the presbyters that had preceded him," end quote. So what's going on here is Polycarp comes to Rome and he says, look, St. John taught me personally to celebrate the Easter festival on the 14th of Nisan. I'm a 14er. And the Pope in Rome says, well, we learned from our ancient authorities, Peter and Paul, to celebrate it on the Sunday after the 14th. So there's a standstill. Both of them are appealing to apostles, John and to Peter. So what happened? They left in peace. Pope Anicetus says, okay, Polycarp, you can celebrate it on the 14th. We'll continue to celebrate it on Sunday. That's fine. Everything's okay. And they left it at that. Well, things began to elevate over the decades because the churches in Smyrna and in Ephesus and in Asia Minor were celebrating it on the 14th day of Nisan. Almost everywhere else, they're celebrating Easter on a Sunday. And this makes things kind of complicated because they are keeping a liturgical fast, which later becomes Lent. And when Christians travel and when bishops get together, their calendars are off. Now, history tells us as it escalated through the ages, we get to the year 193. The bishop in Rome is now Pope Victor. He's one of the first popes to start using Latin in the liturgy. And Pope Victor In 193, writes a letter to the bishop in Ephesus in Asia Minor and all the bishops over there and says, look, I know you guys celebrate Easter still on the 14th of Nisan, even if it lands on a Friday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday, you need to stop doing that. It's disruptive to the church. We all are Catholic. We all are united. We need to have the same liturgical calendar, right? So he sends that and says, stop doing it. Well, the bishops there say, look, we're just following what St. John taught us as we received through Polycarp. We're going to keep doing it. And so Pope Victor's response was to excommunicate all of them, all the bishops in Asia Minor and Ephesus. Now, many of the other bishops in the West appealed to Pope Victor and they said, please don't do that. You know, Anicetus, your predecessor, didn't do that. There's a way we can work around this with charity. We don't need to excommunicate people over the calendar. It was a good call. Irenaeus was involved. A lot of the great early saints were involved in this. And so the excommunication did not happen. But it shows us that Pope Victor did believe he had the authority as Pope to excommunicate all those bishops. And the response to Pope Victor wasn't, hey, you can't do that. You don't have that authority. The response is, you do have the authority, but you shouldn't use it for this reason. Now, those who celebrated Nisan 14, the 14ers, they continued on into the 300s, actually, until finally at the Council of Nicaea, which is in 325, under Constantine, established a universal policy on how to calculate Easter. It's the policy that we use even to this day. There's some discrepancy on using the Gregorian or the Julian calendar. That's why the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics sometimes have or often have different Easters. But we're using the same calculation, which we see here at Nicaea, which goes like this. Easter, according to the Council of Nicaea, should be celebrated on the Sunday after the full moon, after the spring equinox. So we establish the spring equinox, then we get the first full moon after that spring equinox, and then it's the Sunday after that. Got it? Okay, so that is how we calculate Easter. It's how we do it to this day. The early Christians were trying to reproduce what ancient Passover should be. Passover happened in the spring, so spring equinox. It was at a full moon, so it's a full moon after the spring equinox, and then it was a Sunday. The resurrection happened on a Sunday. That is Easter Sunday. And since the moon is always waxing and waning at different times during the year, it appears that full moon appears at different intervals after the spring equinox, and that's what pushes Sunday forward and backwards. It's the moon waxing and waning, but it's our attempt to approximate the Jewish calendar of Nisan 14, 14 being the day of the full moon. So what's the take home here? Well, we can see that in the early church, there's controversy even over things like calendars and liturgy in the beginning, and we still have that a little bit today. But that the Pope himself presumes the power to excommunicate. This harkens back to what we see in Matthew 16. Jesus says to Peter, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Pope Victor is doing that. Is he doing it in the best way? No, and this shows us that there is papal authority, there is papal supremacy, there is canon law, and that sometimes the popes can get maybe a little bit eager, more eager than they should. We see this right here with Pope Victor, and sometimes bishops can come in and kind of even things out. And we see that ultimately it's a council, which is validated by a pope, that helps us even out this celebration of Easter. So thanks so much for watching. God bless you. We'll see you in the next lesson.